Most of the stories that we will read or watch or consume will attempt to represent our world. And when they don't, they usually fall in well-defined genres. So it's science fiction or fantasy or horror or mystery, thriller. And those two have a certain set of expectations that are attached to them, just as reality has expectations that are attached to them. And for a great deal of human history, that's what our stories are supposed to be. They're supposed to represent our world in one way or another. And one of the current postmodern current trends that we've seen is towards stories that do not attempt to be realistic, where they are different, where they deliberately deviate from being a story of the real world. Not just a creative approach to how to describe the world, but the world yourself that you're describing is not really ours. And that is called irrealism. And irrealism is a very postmodern thing. Now, there's a difference between irrealism and just craziness, right? The idea of a realism is that it has a consistent logic. It's often called fabulism. And if you think about it, fabulism is like a fable. Well, let's think about fables, right? They're not realistic, but there is a consistent logic. So, the wolf eats Granny and Red Riding Hood, and the woodsman cuts the wolf's stomach open, and Granny and Red Riding Hood come out unharmed. Well, obviously that wouldn't happen in the real world because they would have to be rent to bits in order to be engulfed by the wolf, and they would be dead long before they ever made it into the wolf's stomach. But in the strategy of the fabular story of the fable, you can do that, and that works fine. And irrealism is something similar, where we're going to deviate from what happens in the world, but we're going to do it in a way where you got something you can grab onto, where the new logic, the different logic, is part of the point. And some of what is delightful about a well-written irrealist story or novel is that you do get introduced to this new logic, this different logic, and it does hold, and it comes back and surprises you in wonderful, delightful ways later on. And again, this is different from, let's say, fantasy, right? In fantasy, we have certain expectations. There's going to be, a low level of technology. There's going to be magic. We'll have wizards and dragons and dwarves, and people shoot arrows, and that you get this whole kind of set of fantasy tropes that you're expecting, and that's really the stock characters and the stock expectations. Irrealism is always different, always unique every time. And to make this make sense, I have a very short, just like the textbook example of irrealism. This is such a perfect example. This is by Mark Lehner from his collection, My Cousin, My Gastroenterologist. And the title of this very short story is The Suggestiveness of One Stray Hair in an Otherwise Perfect Coiffure. Okay? So let's go. He's got a car bomb. He puts the key in the ignition and turns it. The car blows up. He gets out. He opens the hood and makes a cursory inspection. He closes the hood and gets back in. He turns the key in the ignition. The car blows up. He gets out and slams the door shut disgustedly. He kicks the tire. He takes off his jacket and shimmies under the chassis. He pokes around. He slides back out and wipes the grease off his shirt. He puts his jacket back on. He gets in. He turns the key in the ignition. The car blows up, sending debris into the air and shattering windows for blocks. He gets out and says, "Damn it." He calls a tow truck. He gives them his AAA membership number. They tow the car to an Exxon station. The mechanic gets in and turns the key in the ignition. The car explodes, demolishing the gas pumps, the red and blue Exxon logo high atop its pole, bursting like a balloon on a string. The mechanic steps out. You got a car, Mommy says. The man rolls his eyes. I know that, he says. It's a wonderful story, right? It's not in any way realistic, but it's consistent. And it's got this its own logic, and its logic actually plays right to that wonderful line at the end, that beautiful payoff line. And that's just a perfect example of irrealism. So you get a lot of irrealism in a lot of different postmodernism. Even people will stray into it who aren't always there. So if you think about Infinite Jest, David Foster Wallace is not really writing an irrealistic book for most of that. But then he gets into the stuff with the Great Concavity. And it's just crazy, right? They've got these giant catapults along the border, and they're just like flinging their garbage into Canada with these massive catapults. It's just not in any way realistic, and it's nutty, but it's got its own nutty logic that works entirely within it and for it. Some of the greater realists would be Robert Coover, Don Barthelme. These guys are big into that. There's a scene early on in The King, and The King is about King Arthur and his round table. And one of the problems that King Arthur is dealing with in the beginning is that the railroad workers are on strike, and they have welded the engine to the tracks. And you're like, wait a minute, this is King Arthur and his knights, right? But they got the railroad workers on strike, and they've welded the engine to the tracks. So that's irrealist. Right? The Dead Father, also a novel by Don Barthelme, deals with this absolutely gigantic, hundreds of feet long person who is the dead father, who is dead, and also talks to people. And so that sort of thing is very different from what you would get with just a straightforward, realistic kind of book or story. And it gives you more, I think it gives you different possibilities as an author in terms of what you can do with it. Now, it's probably worth addressing magic realism while we're at this. So, how does this compare to magic realism? Magic realism is kind of a squishy term, and I tend to find that the number of definitions of magic realism I get are equivalent to the number of people that I ask. So at its tightest, magic realism is a school of authors, with the most famous being Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but also including some other authors, including the ones I've talked about before, like Julio Cortázar or Jorge Luis Borges, that are writing what is definitely postmodern fiction that isn't strictly realist, that doesn't fall in any traditional genre, and has stuff that happens in it that wouldn't happen in the real world. And this is the key thing, since it's a school, that they're all kind of from a certain region of the world and cultural background. In this case, they're all Latin American authors. And that is certainly the definition that I grew up with when I was in school, and it was pretty clear that that's what people meant when they said magic realism. I have found in the intervening time that that term has kind of spread and blended, and you get all kinds of things that are now being called magic realism. I had a talk with someone for the last few months who cited The Time Traveler's Wife as an example of magic realism. And I would say, look, The Time Traveler's Wife I would absolutely call irrealist. But I would not say that it's magic realism by the terminology that I grew up with, because it is supposed to be this school, this community. But if you want to take a broad definition of magic realism, then I'm going to say at that point it's just irrealism under another name. And if you want to take that narrower definition of magic realism, then magic realism becomes a school, a subset of irrealism, if that makes sense, or fabulism. So what's postmodern about this? Well, what's postmodern about this ultimately is that you are changing the rules in a really fundamental way. Like, we are going to tell a story, and hopefully we can tell a meaningful and impactful, and it can be a tense story, and it can be a story you connect to in a very human way, that is built on a set of assumptions and principles that you couldn't have in our world. And as such, that's a very postmodern kind of concept. Like, even if you go back to the modernists wanted to tell every story in every crazy way they could. But the stories they ultimately told, they wanted those to be real stories about real people in the here and now. They just wanted to tell them in a crazy way. And postmodernists say, no, why don't I tell a story that isn't about, the here and now? I talked in an earlier episode about Vladimir Nabokov sort of reinventing the globe for his story Ada, right? For his novel Ada. Well, that's irrealism, because that isn't our world, right? But it's the what if world that he's going to set his story in. So it's very postmodernist. I'm a big fan of irrealism. I love it a lot. And I love it because it's surprising. It's delightful. Again, if you use the example I read earlier, the wonderful line at the end, the mechanic gets out and says, you got a car bomb, and the guy rolls his eyes and says, I know that. Like, how absolutely delightful and wonderful is that ending? And irrealism affords us opportunities to do that kind of thing in a really fresh way and a unique way. And irrealism, well done, feels like nothing else. And it really feels original and fresh, and probably, some of the authors I mentioned earlier, like could go through the opus of Julio Cortázar, or Borges, or Coover, or Barthelemy, and you'll just see that the breadth and variety of what they do, and the many different angles they can come at, and the many different things they can do to delight us is so broad. Those authors are so broad in what they have been able to deliver. And a lot of that breadth comes from an irrealist viewpoint. So that's one of the terms I'm going to be using a lot, saying a lot in this podcast. And thank you.